you all for joining us. I am Bailey Cacciatore, and in case you're wondering, yes, like the chicken. I am really proud to be up here today and to talk to you guys about Sharlot Hall herself, her life and her lasting legacy, and how the museum got its name thanks to her. And in McKenna's introduction, Sharlot loved Arizona. She really did. And being a third generation myself, I really connect with Sharlot in her mission to preserve Arizona's pioneer history, but even Native American history as well. She found that to be very important. And that's what we'll talk a little bit more about during this, this presentation. And another thing about Sharlot that I would like to note before I really get started is she truly was a remarkable woman. She was also very independent for her time. As we delve a little more into her life, we'll find out just how independent she really was. And I think it's really telling for women of the time how much she wanted to break out of societal norms. But she also wasn't perfect either. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And before I go to the next slide, a quote I would like to talk or give about Sharlot. She wrote in 1911 that there is something better than making a living, it's making a life. And I think Sharlot very much did that. She made a life for herself. It wasn't a living, it was a life. So Sharlot Mabroth Hall was born on October 27th, 1840 in Lincoln County, Kansas. She actually was not originally born in Arizona, she was born in Kansas. She grew up with one younger brother, her brother Edward, also his nickname was Ted. This is Sharlot. And here we have a picture of her with her mother Adeline and her father James. In Kansas, they lived on a farm, and her mother, of course, did most of the chores that a farm woman would do. And Sharlot herself also learned to do many of those chores at an early age. But even from a really young age, and I would say probably about the age that they were in this photo, Sharlot noticed that her parents had kind of a challenging and strained relationship, and she herself had a tense relationship at time with her father. Later, reflecting in life, she would say that her mother was occasionally treated poorly by her father. At times, he could be crude, perhaps resenting that his wife, and increasingly his daughter Sharlot, was more educated than he was. It was not unusual for him to regard Sharlot's poetry as being highbrow. But yet Sharlot's mother very much encouraged Sharlot to pursue her education and to pursue her writing, which is what we'll talk about a little bit more. So while they were in Kansas up until about Sharlot was 10 years old. There was a really horrible winter in the winter of 1880 to 1881. And they lost many of their crops. They had to sell off a lot of their livestock because of how harsh this winter was. So Sharlot's father, James Hall, decided it was time to move the family. And they decided to go west to Prescott because that is where Adeline's family, Sharlot's mother, lived at the time. And according to Sharlot, this was not an easy decision, as Adeline Hall had little voice in the decision to move Arizona. She actually really did not want to move. So in 1882, Sharlot and her family traveled to Arizona by covered wagon. They actually even took the Santa Fe Trail here during their journey. And the journey was about a 6-month travel that it took for them to get from Kansas to Prescott, Arizona. Sharlot herself rode her own pony most of the way, and she helped herd the horses that her father sold once they reached Prescott. However, as I noted, this was a challenging trip, and at some point during this trip, Sharlot's horse got scared. We're not really sure why, but her horse got scared and bucked Sharlot off, and Sharlot landed on her back and severely injured her back. Yet, despite all of this, she got back up, she got back on her horse, and continued the rest of the way, which is really, really remarkable. But because of this, Sharlot did suffer from back pain for the rest of her life. It was something she dealt with, especially as she got older in age, it would continuously flare up. So when the family arrived to Arizona, Charlotte's father, James, found work on a hydraulic gold mining operation nearby on Lynx Lake. So you can see this right here. Unfortunately, I could not tell you which one is James in this photo, but this is the hydraulic mine that he worked on. In 1890, he built a ranch off of the creek in the Agua Fria River and planted fruit trees. And until 1927, Orchard Ranch, as it came to be called, was Charlotte's home. So let me actually go back really quick. That is their home, Orchard Ranch in Lakes Creek, which is actually near Dewey. James and Adeline, along with their children, Charlotte and Edward, they raised pigs, cows, while also growing vegetable, apples, and pears. Today, if you were to go to Orchard Ranch, their home is no longer standing, and it's actually an RV park that you can stay in. But as Charlotte liked to do in her time, especially in her writing, she did a lot of prolific writing, both poetry, diary entries. She wrote magazine articles. And in 1910, she reflected on her early life here in Arizona. To quote, she said, "The little valley in which we made our first home opened out upon a wider, unsettled valley, a great stretch of hills and plain, covered thick and deep with grass. It was a typical settlement, fewer than a dozen families, all having about an equal number of cattle, and all bound together in neighborly friendship by mutual needs and ambitions." So Charlotte's formal education was very limited, but it was diverse. As I noted earlier, her mother had very much encouraged her to get her education. In 1883, Charlotte and her brother attended a 3-month school term in Dewey, about 4 miles from their home, Orchard Ranch. They rode horses, or they would walk to get there. From an early age, Charlotte was writing poems. For instance, her first poem was written just before her 13th birthday. And she shared her poems with her teachers when she was a teenager, and her teachers took notice of her talent. As an adult, Charlotte would reminisce that she spent more time writing verse than working on the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. She wrote that it was a typical country school with homemade blackboard and desks, but the teachers were always good. For even in the beginning, Arizona required more of her teachers. However, as I noted, Charlotte's father did not think highly of education. Generally, working on the ranch took precedence over studying and schoolwork. In about 3 years' time, in 1886, Sharlot Hall had good fortune of attending high school in Prescott. During this time, she visited with retired Judge Henry Fleury, who was living in the governor's mansion. He fascinated her with stories of early Arizona. And as she continued to write, by the age of 20, she sold her very first article to a children's magazine of $4, which may not sound like a lot, but this would have been 1890. And to account for today's inflation, that's actually $140 in today's money that she got for selling that article. So not bad. And while she was attending school in Prescott, she did work for her board and room, because even though we have cars now, when Charlotte was of student age, it was a long travel between Prescott and Dewey, so she had to stay for her room and board here. And in doing so, she did some housekeeping in the home of Judge Sumner Howard. She returned to the ranch to help out during the weekends, especially as she got older. Her mother's health was not in good condition, and Charlotte was still needed at home. And so growing up on a ranch in rural Arizona, she was very much aware of the challenges and dangers of women giving birth. So I kind of gave a little foreshadowing about Charlotte's independent and forward thinking, and so we're going to get a little bit into that. Charlotte, during her time on the ranch, watched women who bore children, especially frequently, affect the health of both the infants and the mothers. Charlotte was deeply affected, and as such, for much of her life, she really did not hold marriage in high regard. She firmly believed that she could lead a fulfilling, enriching life as an independent woman. Mind you, this is late 1800s, going soon into the early 1900s. That was very forward thinking for her time. At one point during her tenure as the territorial historian, which I will get to in a little bit, she says, "Arizona is a land where every earnest woman may make her life count more for the general good than in any older community, where the lines of development already are fixed and inflexible. Every woman may feel justly that she is a living factor in the building of a great new state, that here she is not merely a follower of noble ideals, but may herself help to incorporate them into the everyday life of the people. And in another quote that she wrote in 1912, she went on to say, "I have gone with many and many a mother down into the valley of the shadow, and helped her bring back a pitiful babe, maimed and marred by the father's selfishness and predestined to pain and failure by his dull, stolid, witless attitude toward wife and family. Indeed, these tragedies, witnessed in such naked agony in poor frontier homes, made me deliberately decide, when still a young girl, never to marry." But that's not to say Sharlot still didn't have some romance in her life either. Possibly a little foreshadowing there. So, spending her childhood and teenage years in rural areas, as we mentioned, Sharlot was a woman who read widely and had a hunger for knowledge. And as I said, although her formal education was very limited, she still spent every time that she could reading and writing, to which her mother very much encouraged. In early 1895, she met Samuel Putnam, who was the leader in the free thought movement. And this relationship would inform her life greatly. So a little background on the free thought movement. It was a philosophical viewpoint which holds that positions regarding truth should be formed on the basis of logic and reason, rather than authority or tradition. The cognitive application of free thought is known as free thinking, and practitioners of free thought are known as free thinkers. And free thought holds that individuals should not accept ideas proposed as truth without resource or recourse to knowledge and reason. Thus, free thinkers strive to build their opinions on the basis of facts, scientific inquiry, and logical principles, independent of any logical fallacies or the intellectuality limiting effects of authority, prejudice, tradition, and all other dogmas. And so, through these free thought movements, and after she met Samuel Putnam, she started attending his lectures here in Prescott, and he visited Sharlot and her family at their ranch. She greatly admired Putnam, and, well, foreshadowing, it appears they may have even been romantically involved. He was in his 50s and Sharlot was in her mid-20s, and after they left, they corresponded, and in their letters, they discussed the oppression of women in traditional marriage. Free thinkers did not believe that love had to be contained in traditional marriages that were sanctioned by the church. And in a lot of Sharlot's writings as well, she reminisces very fondly of Samuel Putnam and how much he really led her to become the woman that she was. And she actually even gave a lecture herself on the topic of free thought here in Prescott. It was very well received. In late December of 1896, though, unfortunately, Samuel Putnam died of gas poisoning. And Sharlot was very devastated and deeply mourned his death. Her poems and other writings illustrated that this relationship had a strong impact on her. And she mourned for quite some time. She mourned for about a year. In June of 1897, so about 6 to 7 months after his passing, she wrote a poem titled Alone, in which she expressed her thoughts. To quote one line from the poem, "Cease to mourn, thou hast thy memories, but for me, Krishna decreed no friend, and though I wander all the worlds, I am yet alone." And through that, as far as we are aware, Sharlot really potentially did not have any other love interests. Samuel always was very close to her heart throughout her adult life and continued with these free thought lectures and thinking as well. And as I noted, she did continue to write even following his death, and she did achieve great success publishing articles and poems. She received payment for her writings, and this income did greatly help her with her family at the ranch. It appears that her family was cash poor, like many ranching and farming families throughout Arizona. They had food because they grew it, and they owned land and a place to live, but often they really did not have much actual cash. So as Sharlot continues these writings and time goes on, Samuel Putnam's passing, she went over to Los Angeles to take over the duties of editor of the magazine Land of Sunshine. She had previously written for this magazine, and editor Charles Lummis was helping her to become an even better writer. Lummis changed the name from Land of Sunshine to Out West, and Sharlot's poems were featured prominently in this new magazine. During her time in Los Angeles, she met many talented writers and enjoyed working and socializing with people very differently than those she knew back home in Dewey. Another important relationship during this time that Sharlot formed is the women's clubs in Arizona. Sharlot began speaking at women's clubs in 1900. During the early 20th century, women in communities throughout the state formed these clubs that worked to build a cultural and social life of their communities, and to even help women get out of the home as well. They did things like fund libraries and historical societies. Here in Prescott, the Monday Club raised funds for the first public library in town and then volunteered in the library. Sharlot was a guest of the Monday Club here in Prescott several times and became friends with Frances Munns, who was a prominent leader in the women's suffrage movement. Sharlot also spoke and recited poetry at the Arizona Federation of Women's Club annual statewide conference in 1902 when it was held here in Prescott. Through these gatherings, she became known by many active and outspoken Arizona women who would support her later in life. She became their chair of the History Committee of the Arizona Federation of Women's Clubs in 1903, and she held this position until 1914, so even a couple years post-statehood. In this role, she spoke annually to the Federation about Arizona history, and through this position is when she started to gain her prominence as a renowned historian. So we started to get to a point in Sharlot's life where she was very known, very prolific for her writings. She was even starting to make money for them, but now she's also getting to be known as a historian. And it's important to mention that Sharlot was studying and writing about Arizona for several years before she was officially appointed Arizona Territorial Historian. She was also building relationships with people throughout the state. These folks would help her later on. What follows are examples of her determination and intellect in preserving the history of early Arizona. In 1902, Charles Poston, who was called the father of Arizona, died in poverty in an adobe home in Phoenix. Sharlot went to that home and salvaged some of his photos and documents. She saw the need to save materials and memories of Arizona Territory's first generation of pioneers. And so early on, this was really her first time collecting these kind of relics. She was inspired by the Southwest Museum in LA, which Charles Lummis, who she had worked for at the magazine Out West, had founded. And she wanted to have a similar one here in Prescott. In 1905, after President Roosevelt ordered joint statehood for both Arizona and New Mexico territories, Sharlot had some thoughts about it. And so she wrote a poem titled Arizona, which she very much praised Arizona and advocated that Arizona become its own state and to not be joined into the union with New Mexico. She arranged that a copy of her poem went to every member of both the U.S. congressional bodies, the Senate and the House. And although it is really hard to tell if her poem had any direct effect on the decision, it should be noted that joint statehood was deleted after that, and Arizona did not join the Union as a part of New Mexico. So now we're going to get a little more into her time in territorial legislature. I do want to point out, again, Sharlot being a very prolific and independent woman, she was the first and only woman to hold a legislature position in the territory of Arizona. In the Women's Club, in the Women's Club, including a letter written by the Phoenix Women's Club, and the publisher of the Arizona Republican had pushed for Sharlot to get a new job as territorial historian. In this capacity, she began traveling widely throughout the territory, examining collections and libraries, writing annual reports, and as I noted, she was the first person to hold an office position. In 1910, she was set off to see Arizona and to record history, traveling with guide Al Doyle. She interviewed old-timers, such as Brother Joseph Fish, a Mormon who had been sent to settle in Arizona by Brigham Young. She also visited trading posts at Ganado and even saw a Hopi snake dance, and we'll get a little bit more into that as well. So during her time as territorial historian, Sharlot embarked on a very large journey to tour the Arizona Strip of the north of the Grand Canyon. And this was going to be about a 60-day trip that she was going to do by wagon. And I like to think it's thanks to Sharlot and her prolific research and writing that what is now the northern rim of the Grand Canyon did not become part of Utah, and it stayed within Arizona. And she spent a lot of time here as well, and we'll get to some lantern slides during her travels here. But she did a lot of writing during her trip. She published installments in the Arizona Magazine from December 1911 to August of 1913, describing the country and the people of the Arizona Strip. These writings in Sharlot's diary were later used in the publication Sharlot Hall on the Arizona Strip. And when she was traveling, of course, this trip was extremely hazardous. So if we look here, Sharlot toured most of this northern strip right here. And if any of you have been to the Grand Canyon, especially the North Rim, even by car, that is not a quick, easy trip. You have to go around the canyon, through Utah, and back down into northern Arizona. And they definitely had some troubles when they went through here. So at one point, this is when they were crossing the Little Colorado River, they had oxen with them pulling their wagons. And this is also when they were crossing at Lee's Ferry as well. And another painted slide of crossing Lee's Ferry. And if I recall correctly in one of Sharlot's writings, she said this bridge, or I believe boat that she took across, felt very unstable, and at times she wasn't even sure if they were going to be able to cross the Colorado at certain times. And as I noted, not only was she interested in Western pioneer history, she was very interested in Native American history, and she visited many sites in northern Arizona during this trip, including Wupaki, which is up near Flagstaff, and Moncopi, which is on the Hopi Reservation as well. She got to witness Hopi snake dance. She got to be involved with the people in these areas, and she grew a great fondness for indigenous peoples and their culture. And so as she was collecting pioneer artifacts, Western artifacts from the first pioneers here in Arizona, she then started collecting Native American artifacts as well, because she recognized that their culture is just as important as our pioneer culture here. And so, as I said, they traveled and camped for about 2.5 months exploring northern Arizona. And she continued to write about the people that she met. It was quite prolific for really any person to go on a journey such as this, but especially a woman as well. And I would also like to note really quickly that the lantern slides that you have been seeing in these last few presentation slides are available at our archive here at Sharlot Hall. So in November of 1910, Cactus and Pine, a collection of Sharlot's poems, was published. The book was reviewed very well by reviewers in the East and the West, and has gone through multiple editions and is currently now sold in our museum store. And as we all know, on February 14th, 1912 is when Arizona officially became a state of the Union. Territorial Governor Sloan lost his job, and George W.P. Hunt was elected governor. At the time, people across the state became involved in a lively discussion about Sharlot Hall and whether or not she should retain her position as historian. As was customary with political appointment, she did resign from her post. However, the Women's Club backed her and lobbied for her to be reinstated by Governor Hunt, as well as various individuals from around the state who wrote letters on her behalf to state officials, as well as communicated directly to Sharlot their wish for her to be reappointed. And McDuffie of the Mining and Estate Office of Chloride, Arizona, even wrote to her on February 3rd, 1912. And give me just a second here. I lost my mouse. All right, I'll have to read a kind of clipped version of this, but as I noted, McDuffie of the Mining Assay Office wrote, "This is the time near when the new officials of state will be seated and the affairs of government revised and adjusted in many ways. You don't know how pleased I was to be the Women's Club at their late meeting in Phoenix, endorsed by yourself to be held over by Governor Hunt as historian. As I have repeatedly stated, we are all of us ready to have you be in this position." So unfortunately, though, Sharlot was not reinstated as historian. It went to another gentleman instead. And I would also like to know, I kind of know this earlier, Sharlot's mother, Adeline, was in poor health, and she was really not doing well during Sharlot's Northern Arizona trip that she was doing. And at one point during her trip, she got word that her mother had fallen severely ill and needed to return home. And Sharlot very much demanded that her guide, Al Doyle, take her back to Williams, which was going to be the nearest train station, for her to then come back to Prescott. Well, at one point, they came to a crossing at nighttime that the guide felt was very dangerous and didn't want to do it. Sharlot, being the independent woman that she is and determined to see her mother before she passed, pulled out a little handy-dandy pistol from her bag and pointed it at Al Doyle and told him to keep going. And so they did. Unfortunately, Sharlot was able to make it home and be with her mother. And she sat with her mother in the hospital. Adeline did die in August 24th, 1912, and was cremated in Los Angeles. And at this point, after Adeline's passing, Sharlot did take over much of her mother's responsibilities at their Orchard Ranch home. So during the 1920s, after her mother's passing, Sharlot was really struggling. She was having to care for her father, who was becoming very senile and irrational and even at times abusive. She was also having to do the work that her mother did around Orchard Ranch, and it was also difficult to keep hired men working at the ranch because of her father. Nevertheless, she did decide to continue living with her father at the ranch because he was comfortable there and would not adjust to a new place, despite her attempted discussions with him. And during this time, she was awarded an honorary Master of Arts degree from the University of Arizona, but could not attend the ceremony because, well, again, things were difficult at home. These were hard years for Sharlot, but she continued her writings and found comfort in her poetry. And during this time as well, Sharlot was made an honorary member of several women's clubs, and she was invited to speak at different events. She was very well liked and well known throughout the state. And in her experience as territorial historian, she reflected on the influence of women's clubs and organizations of women, further explaining, in Arizona, women exercise an unusual influence upon public life, and organizations of women further much of the work, educational, civic, and social, that in older communities, it is in the hands of churches and benevolent and educational institutions. Clubs and associations have been formed with the earnest purpose to be of largest helpfulness. And in the work of the Arizona Club, women has been commended in the annual report of a recent governor. So despite having a difficult home at life, Sharlot was still finding these community connections through women's clubs and her writings. And despite the struggles that Sharlot had at home, she was still a ranch woman at heart. You can see here, she is feeding some baby pigs here. And as a lovely colleague of mine noted, Sharlot was possibly a Disney princess of her time. She explained that I myself have a homestead of 160 acres and hope to get more land. For my own experience has proved that a woman may succeed in making a comfortable living from poultry, dairying, light farming, and fruit growing. And during this time, she continued to write about the capability of women. In this same article, she explained, "In my own work has taken me to nearly all parts of Arizona and permitted me to know intimately many self-supporting women and many fine, earnest, successful women in homes on ranches and farms, and in city and mining camps, and there can be no question that Arizona is the woman's state, where she is surely of opportunity, friendliness, and fair play. I know that any woman of fair health, common sense, and willingness to work may make a living here, either in town or in country, and build up for herself a comfortable home and make herself a respected and useful citizen." And so Sharlot really took account what ranch life was like. And I think as she got older, she understood why her mom stayed and why her mom did all this work, because it is still important. It's still important to the family, it's important to your community, and it's important to gain these life experiences. So another little foreshadowing that I did, Sharlot, very independent of her time. She obviously did not care to marry. She did not care to have children. And she very much felt that women could thrive without the help of a man, that a woman could very much lead her own life and compete and excel in professional careers and be forward thinking. But as I also noted, Sharlot was still a product of her time, and no one is perfect. So I don't know if you remember at the very beginning, I was talking about Sharlot's family and her brother Edward, nicknamed Ted. Well, in 1908, her brother married a Mexican woman. Sharlot did not like that, and she actually cut off her brother after that. In one of her writings, she noted, "Word from Ted today. End of all but sad times." And from that point on, she did not speak to him again. And if anyone had asked Sharlot about her brother, she would claim that he was killed in a Mexican skirmish. But kind of interesting, despite cutting all contact off with her brother and not talking to him again, when he did actually pass in 1928, she did attend his funeral in Tucson. So even despite those racial prejudices, I think deep down she still had care for her brother. But I would, coming from my personal standpoint, I do find it interesting that she didn't care for one set of racial group, but felt very closely connected with another racial group. So kind of interesting. But again, this is just to point out that Sharlot herself was not a perfect person. She was very forward thinking in a lot of ways, but also very much a product of her time. In January of 1925, Sharlot Hall was elected as an elector who would carry Arizona's electoral votes to Washington for Calvin Coolidge. And this was not a simple matter, and she had to do some wrangling to get this honor. She was a Republican, so when Calvin Coolidge, also a Republican, won the presidential election, it was guaranteed that a Republican would take the electoral vote to Washington, D.C. However, there were 3 people vying for this honor. One of the other candidates was a flamboyant salesman named George Ford, while the other was Judge Campbell of Phoenix. Sharlot knew the judge, and she wrote to him, asking for his support for her to be the elector. George Ford also contacted Judge Campbell, and he wanted the 3 of them to draw straws to determine who would go. Seemed very professional, right? Judge Campbell was the chair of the committee, and he met with Ford and told him that rather than drawing straws, Campbell wanted Sharlot to have the honor, and so therefore she would go. She was in Washington, D.C. from January 22nd until the inauguration in March of 1925. She stayed at the home of Arizona Senator Cameron and his wife, and they traveled to New York City and Boston. When she cast her electoral vote, she wore, a copper overlay dress that was created for her by the Arizona Industrial Commission. And for those of you who have been to our museum before, you may recognize this copper overlay dress in display in the Lawler building. And it was all handmade. The copper dress is individual copper links that are hooked together. And I believe this dress weighs about 10 pounds. Yeah, it doesn't sound very comfortable. So going back in time a little bit, I want to start talking about now how Sharlot came to acquire what is now the governor's mansion and how she got the museum to where it is today. In 1917, the Arizona State Legislature gave the city of Prescott $7,000 to purchase the old governor's mansion. And at this point, so to kind of back up a little bit, the governor's mansion was built in 1863. Was then occupied in 1864 when we officially became a territory. And over the years, as I'm sure I hope most of you, if not all of you know, the capital moved a lot. We started here in Prescott, it went down to Tucson, came back to Prescott, and then ultimately settled in Phoenix, which is still the capital today. And during that time, eventually the governor's mansion did have many hands in it, many different owners, many different uses. And by this time in the in the late 1910s and into the 1920s, it really wasn't in the best condition and had changed a lot. So with the help of Pauline O'Neill, who was the widow of Bucky O'Neill in a state legislature, they introduced this bill to have the $7,000 given to the city of Prescott to purchase governor's mansion, and it was passed and signed by the governor. But it was at this time that Sharlot was not yet actually associated with the governor's mansion. During World War I, copper prices soared, and Humboldt, a smelter town nearby, was very busy. Sharlot and her hired men sold chickens and produce there, traveling by wagon and then in a Studebaker truck. In 1919, Sharlot Hall suggested in an article in the Courier that the governor's mansion should be made into a museum. Interesting. In 1927, Sharlot's dream was a few steps closer to becoming reality. In May of 1927, she began negotiations with the city of Prescott regarding the restoration of the governor's mansion. And on June 6th, the city granted Sharlot a life lease of the governor's mansion and the surrounding grounds, which included free water, electricity, police, and fire protection. In exchange for this, Sharlot agreed to have her historical collection placed in the mansion, along with maintaining and improving the property. So I think it might be befitting if I stop talking here for a second, and just for a really quick minute, if I can find my mouse, I would like to have Sharlot actually talk about the governor's mansion a little bit. My apologies, I don't know where my mouse went. There it is.
Sharlot, we're here today, I believe it's June 4th, in this wonderful historical shrine that you've done for posterity. And we'd like very much for you to just tell us something about the old famous house, the people who were here, how it was built, anything that you like.
But I think as long as the wind is blowing today, I mean, doors are banging and occasional window banging, that it might be a good time to say that there being no houses, no settlement whatever upon the site selected, that when the logs had been cut, probably within a short distance from where the house now stands, and dragged in, many of them showed a mark of just of log chains where they were dragged in by ox teams, possibly mule teams, and the house itself was hurried to completion as fast as possible with a small amount of workers, because they were eager to get under cover. They'd been out since so long in September of the year before, 63, and I have a particularly interesting letter that I'd like to read on a windy day like this. In which the Secretary of State who became the second governor tells an old friend of his, an old gentleman whom he knew in Massachusetts, of how wonderful it is to be where the wind cannot blow his pages. He was the one who had charge of most of the business, and he had carried on all of the official part of it in his little tent, using his bed for a table, and the wind coming in through the doors, so they'll be back 200 they should wake us up under the bed or in the corners of the tent. And this pattern of old house where you could stuff the doors and windows reminded me of my mother's after you had been a year in Arizona and had lived outdoors or in things at that time. As you go around the little house that was provided for us, shutting up all the doors, even when it was young enough to leave them open from open, and even the windows. It seemed so good to have a place that was still used to read and enjoy today.
May I interrupt just a moment, Charlotte? This being 1940, what year was it that the old house was built here?
Well, it was begun just about this time in June. In fact, the bid for, I don't know what you really call them, but when you advertise in newspapers, people come and build a house for you. It came just about this time, and the work was hurried just as fast as it could be because of the discomfort of living in the tents. And so, because they had about a year and a half of it at one time. But doubtless that work could be hurried a little more because this land all about here was material very near at hand. And many of the logs that were built into the old house were cut in a very short distance. Others were dragged in by yokes of cattle. And one great beautiful tree was cut within what is now one of the rooms, in fact, very near to where we're speaking. Well, when I started to put down a concrete floor so that the room could be better used as part of the museum, the first thing we came upon was a stump of a pine tree that must have been, well, perhaps 3 feet across, maybe more. And that old wood was as perfect as could be. Looked almost as if it might drop little branches and blow down.
So that is just a small clip of an interview Sharlot did in June of 1940. And that interview was actually conducted by Grace Chapman, who I will be talking about a little bit. And I know it's kind of hard to hear, especially with the accent, but Sharlot was talking about when she took over Governor's Mansion and getting some work done on it. And, you know, she mentioned by the towards the end of that little clip, she had hired men put in a concrete floor, and she was talking about some of the lumber or the timber that was used from the nearby Prescott National Forest to create the Governor's Mansion. And I just wanted to include that little clip because, one, I think it's really fascinating to actually hear from the woman herself, Sharlot Hall. And even in just that little snippet, you could hear her love for the Governor's Mansion and for Arizona history. And although she didn't say it in this interview, in another interview I've heard of hers, and it could just be the accent of the time, but one thing I also found really interesting is when she would mention Arizona, she pronounced it Arizona instead of Arizona. I don't know why, I found that very, very interesting.
Charlotte, we're here.
Sorry about that. So 1928, the Gubernatorial Governor's Museum officially opened to the public. And at the time, Sharlot did not charge an admission fee. She really didn't ask for anything. She did ask for donations here and there, but she wanted people to be able to come and just see the Governor's Mansion and see her wide collection that she had in there. But of course, as time went on, her collection continued to grow and interest continued to grow. And eventually got to the point she needed some more room. She needed some more room for her collection. So at this point, we're going into the late 1920s, 1930s, and we're in the period of the Great Depression. People were struggling to put food on the table and maintain their living arrangements. And Sharlot herself even wrote about the conditions. The closing of the copper mines has thrown thousands of people out of work, and half the towns in Arizona are like abandoned places. All winter, people went away, if they could go. And along the railroads and highways, people from further east struggled to get to California and the warmer regions of southern Arizona. They begged for food and for gasoline to keep going, many of them having cars of some sort, and the little settlements were just swamped with a retreating army in the wartime. Now that it is warmer, they are spreading out into the hills and mountains in the hope of a placer mining and getting a few cents a day just to get out of the gravel. Bars that were once worked 50 years ago. Sometimes they really do pan out a few cents, or once in a while, maybe you can get $1 or more. But the old diggings are very lean of gold, and having been worked over all these years, there wasn't much to come by. Some of the folks did manage to come up with enough gold dust to either buy bacon or beans, which averaged about $1.50 a day. So in 1932, some federal funding began assisting the destitute in Prescott. Grace Sparks administered the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which provided work to some unemployed men. 3 men assisted Sharlot in cleaning up and maintaining the governor's mansion through this funding. And then in 1933, soon the New Deal funding aided the development of the museum. On November 23rd, Grace Sparks, head of the Yavapai County Civil Works Administration, and she was also a longtime friend of Sharlot Hall, obtained funding for a new museum building to be constructed just west of the governor's mansion. This building is what we now call the Sharlot Hall building. But Sharlot herself called it the House of 1,000 Hands. And she called it this because so many different men had a helping hand in constructing the Sharlot Hall building. Construction began in November of 1933, and the men used rough stone hauled from the Lynx Creek area. Red sandstone, which was used for the floor, came from the vicinity of Ash Fork. They built a vault to store items that were particularly valuable so they wouldn't be destroyed if there was a fire. And they felt that the stone construction would make the building safer from fire than the governor's mansion, which, made out of logs. The CWA program ended in February of 1934 and was replaced by the Federal Emergency Relief Administration in April of the same year, but the level of funding was much slower and work on the House of 1,000 Hands did slow. So Sharlot wrote a little bit about the men working on this building. The men who worked here did not think much about history. They were concerned with earning a grub stake, and their periods of work have often been short. And the big stone house reflects the many moons of many minds, the varying skill of many, many hands, rather than the courage and good cheer and high hopes of those who swung axe and broadaxe on the old governor's mansion. The days of gold, with their boundless dreams and visions, live in every log on the old house of the governor's mansion. The big stone house is of another day. It grew out of keen human need that could not dream. Men must eat and must be sheltered, and many, many men must work even for only a few days each. So this new House of 1,000 Hands is a house of service, a house of human needs. Every stone in the walls was brought here because some men needed a paycheck. Laid that some family might be warm and sheltered and fed. It could not be like other houses, at least while I live in it. It could not have careless uses. It must be a house of service, a house of help, and a house of inspiration. There were also other WPA projects happening at the time during the museum. People helped with cataloging, and the Works Project Administration funds were also used to build the ranch house and to move Fort Misery onto the museum grounds. And these projects were completed in November of 1936. And getting this federal money was very vital to the museum. By 1936, Sharlot wrote that she had spent everything she had in the sale of the family ranch and cattle, so she relied on the federal assistance and other money that she could raise. Plus, the museum was receiving some state money, and Sharlot received a modest monthly salary administered by the museum board. And so, yes, at one point after Sharlot had acquired the governor's mansion and opened the museum, her father did eventually fall ill and passed away. And she sold the Orchard Ranch and was able to use some of those funds to help with projects around the museum. And so, as I had noted earlier, Sharlot did suffer a series of health problems. She suffered great back pain throughout her life that continued to get worse and worse as she got older. And she even started suffering some heart problems. In 1942, Sharlot Hall turned many administrative duties over from the museum to Grace Chapman, who I said interviewed Sharlot. So their interview took place about 2 years before this. And Grace Chapman is just one of the many individuals who were involved in the creation of what is now the Sharlot Hall Museum. And her and many other women are featured and honored in what we have now as our Rose Garden, which we also have a Rose Garden kiosk located in the Sharlot Hall building if you have not seen it. So, as all good things must come to an end, and shortly after that in 1943, Sharlot did go into the Arizona Pioneers home on April 2nd, my apologies. And for those of you who don't know, the Pioneers home is on the big hill just right behind us. But she was only there for 7 days before she unfortunately and ultimately suffered a heart attack and died on April 9th. And although Sharlot had requested that there be no service following her death, her friends and admirers organized a funeral. It was held here at the museum, and Arizona Governor Sidney P. Osborne delivered the eulogy. She was laid to rest at the Pioneer Cemetery here in Prescott, and this is a photo of her headstone as well, which you can still go see today. And, you know, in a lot of ways, Sharlot was a quiet woman while still being very outspoken. And I would like to think that Sharlot would be proud of where we are with the Sharlot Hall Museum today. In the years following her passing, actually not even years, Grace Chapman and other women did reopen at the time, the Gubernatorial Governor's Museum, only about a month and a half after her passing. And then it wasn't long after that that the museum actually then was renamed to the Sharlot Hall Museum, and the Prescott Historical Society was established. And so just to summarize before I end things here, Sharlot, again, remarkable, talented, and a hardworking woman, and made great contributions to Arizona history. She was a writer, she was a proponent of museums' rights, she was a historian, she was a free thinker, and I like to think Sharlot definitely had a hand in paving way for women to be successful and independent that they are today, and also allowed us to still have the museum here, which now we have 11 buildings on 4 acres. 6 of those 11 buildings are historic, and we are seeing more and more visitors to this day. So thank you all and I hope you enjoyed this presentation on Sharlot.